And so we are now pushing for a third resolution, which gets all this stuff in writing. So this issue of transparency, this issue of capacity, and we're trying to get a text which will encourage the exchange of information and data between states who have experience and those who haven't and have contamination problems, such as Iraq. And Iraq's a real issue that, you know, at least 140 tons of DU is being used there. The government, also by the UK government. But the US has refused to hand over the targeting coordinates of where this was used. So there's 440 tons of DU unaccounted for in Iraq, which, you know, in 2003, a lot of the fighting was in civilian areas. You know, Saddam didn't engage people out in the desert. He brought all his troops into the towns and cities, and these are the places that were attacked. And so we're dealing with DU contamination, contaminated vehicles, contaminated buildings, all where people are living, or where people have had to go back to work, on agricultural land where people are wanting to start farming again. And it would be unthinkable if it was landmines or cluster munitions that you wouldn't reveal whereabouts these sites are. And, you know, it's a very simple and basic thing we're asking for. But at the same time, if we get the data, it's going to really help facilitate the extra research that we have to do to find out how much of an impact these weapons have had.
So, Doug, what will the effect be if you get this resolution and the 4 user countries don't sign the resolution? What actually happens in the UN when that kind of thing happens? How do the politics play out with that, and how, you know, what would happen?
Okay, well, I think the first thing to understand is that these UN resolutions are non-binding. And this is sort of their limitation, but then at the same time, as far as our campaign is concerned, they're very good for raising awareness of an issue. So, you know, a couple of years ago, very few diplomats were aware of DU. Yeah, they'd heard of it, but they didn't understand the issue in any detail because they didn't have to understand the issue in any detail. The more resolutions that we can get passed, and the ones which have quite specific wording in requesting states to do something, while it's not going to force them to do it, it's going to raise awareness and give a general sort of perception among states that something should be done, which obviously it should. If we get our third resolution, then we can start looking at other options to take the issue forward. There's a UN forum. There's a UN forum which deals specifically with conventional weapons which have inhumane effects. This is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, and this is like a treaty program where every now and again they add a new unpleasant weapon to this and sort of ban it. And it's not particularly effective because it has to work by consensus, and obviously the main users and producers of these weapons are in there, but it will give us a foot in the door, and it's the next stage, the next step essentially. And this is the body which has develops these norms over transparency over the use of certain types of armaments. So one thing we'd maybe like to look at is to get DU added to these, so it becomes a norm that if DU is used, then this data has to be transferred, or wherever DU has been used, then we get the data for it and then can then go and do more serious research. We could then look maybe at the potential of trying to get a DU convention, which is a specific convention banning the use of DU, but that's probably a few years off. And the difficult thing for us, and I think the difficult thing for most members of the public, is that, you know, people, the general response to uranium weapons is one of sort of shock and horror and revulsion. People can't understand why their governments are using radioactive and chemically toxic weapons against other people. You know, it would be unspeakable to use weapons like this. And, you know, in London, you'd be accused of using a dirty bomb, whereas apparently in Iraq, you know, it's not really a problem. So that's one thing we do have on our side. But then at the same time, because disarmament works extremely slowly, for the most part, it's the challenge for us is to try and explain, you know, we're taking these small steps forward, and to most members of the public, they find it very strange that it can't just be banned overnight. But unfortunately, life in disarmament isn't quite that simple. So we're taking small steps, but we're kind of heading in the right direction, and with each step we build up more momentum until finally it's unstoppable and we can get towards a DU convention, a DU treaty.
So you know, that's really interesting, and along those lines, the cluster munitions have been added to that unconventional convention, right?
Yeah, they've been a rather interesting situation. I mean, cluster munitions were first used in a big way in the late 60s, early 70s, and even as what 5 or 6 years ago, um, they were being looked at by the CCW, but only in terms of their post-conflict management. So they were being added to this protocol on explosive remnants of war. And these are things which are left over, which have failed to work properly, or weapons that have been abandoned and present an issue and a threat to civilians. And cluster munitions have been included in this, but it's like it's always about dealing with the problem after the weapons have been used, rather than actually stopping the weapons being used in the first place.
Right.
And eventually there's states like Norway and New Zealand and others, they got very frustrated with the fact that the CCW seemed incapable of dealing with this issue. And Norway started a treaty process outside the UN, which was the Oslo process. And that managed to conclude a new convention in just 2 years, which was amazing, incredible speed. And it's a very powerful convention, and it's far more powerful than anything the CCW would ever produce. And the CCW at the moment is trying to catch up by producing a new protocol on cluster munitions. But the protocol is much weaker than that of the Cluster Munition Convention. So it presents states with a bit of an issue with, if you're already a signatory to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and then you're also still in the CCW working towards a weaker protocol, would you ratify a weaker protocol when you've already ratified a far stronger treaty on cluster munitions? So the CCW is in a bit of a pickle at the moment about cluster munitions, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes over the next few months.
So you're kind of trying to avoid that problem, I guess, with DU by making sure it's part of that Convention on Unconventional Weapons, right?
The CCW is kind of the natural place where this as an issue would be discussed. Now, whether they will be successfully be able to deal with this as an issue is a matter of debate. And, if they are incapable of doing that, then that's the point where it might have to look to go outside the UN process. But this is, several years down the line, I think. And even with cluster munitions, it can take a sudden political effect. So when Israel attacked Lebanon in 2006, they used a huge number of cluster munitions, mostly in the last 72 hours of the conflict, spread them all over civilian areas. And that caused such indignation around the world that was the political spur for the Oslo process to start working. So in many respects, Israel has sort of been responsible for one of the biggest arms control victories in the last few years. So whether it's going to take something like that with DU, whether it have to be used again, or whether there will be the political will to actually deal with it, and particularly to deal with it on a precautionary basis, because at the moment it's very difficult to do the scientific epidemiological work in Iraq or elsewhere because of the security situation, because the health administration is so disturbed, because populations have been moving around. It's very difficult to get the kind of data which the UK or the US would insist on having before taking action. Hopefully there'll be other countries who are more willing to take a precautionary stance, and these are the people who we're wanting to work with.